Dr. Kristin Hayes. Today I'm here to talk to you about the differences between the modern flute and the Baroque flute, or the traverso. The Baroque flute was played during the Baroque period, which lasted roughly from 1600 to 1750. This is a descendant of the recorder. However, unlike the recorder, which was meant to be held in front of the body, the Baroque flute, or the traverso, was held to the side or transversely to the body. This specific instrument is a replica by Simon Pollock. It is made of boxwood, and it is in 4 separate pieces, each with an imitation ivory end cap. A couple of obvious differences between these two instruments are really in terms of construction, sound, and style. The modern flute is made out of some type of metal, whereas the traverso is made of wood. The modern flute has an extensive key system that is supported through the use of rods and springs. On our traverso, we have one simple key, the D sharp key. Now, this is where these two instruments actually have some similarities. Both have this same right hand pinky key. However, on our modern flute, this is really used to help balance the instrument because of all the weight of the keys. On our traverso, this key has a much more practical function in terms of pitch. This key, when vented, will raise the note and make it a little bit more sharp for those notes that are particularly flat. Pitch was also much lower during the Baroque period. Today, we play usually between 440 and 444, whereas Baroque instruments would play anywhere from 390 to 415. That's part of the reason this instrument's in separate pieces. It would allow the instrumentalist to change these and affect the pitch without affecting the rest of the instrument. This instrument is at 415, as I said, so if I play the same D on both of these instruments, you will hear how on the traverso, it's about a half step lower. Same note, same fingering, just slightly different pitch. In terms of other differences, I want to talk about the scale of these two instruments. If I go back to my modern flute and I cover all of the holes and I lift the keys one at a time, that plays a C scale. If I do the same thing on my traverso, cover all of my holes except for this key, and lift the fingers one at a time, it plays a D major scale. I mentioned the recorder as a predecessor to the traverso. The recorder tended to play better in flat keys and the traverso in sharps. So it was very common for instrumentalists of the time to be doublers and play both instruments. And usually the distinction of which instrument to play would be based off of the key signature. And I myself use this. If I'm playing a piece with a lot of flats, I'm more likely to play it on recorder than I am on traverso because I want to avoid what are called cross fingerings. Cross fingerings are when we have to fork a note to change the pitch. This is not ideal, and this is exactly why we have this extensive mechanism. Did you notice how the ranges of these instruments differed? The Baroque flute plays fuller low notes and softer high notes, whereas our modern instruments, the high notes tend to be the loudest. This is due to the construction of the bore. The Baroque flute has a conical bore, which means the top of the instrument is wider than the end. whereas our modern flute is considered cylindrical. The top is actually more narrow, and as we go to the end of the foot joint, it gets wider. Therefore, the sound is developing that way. Because of the very unique different sounds of these instruments, their music is also quite different. Baroque music tended to be lighter in style and more articulate, whereas more modern music demands more dynamic contrast, bigger and louder sounds. This also has to do with the venues that these instruments would have been performed in. Concert halls during the Baroque period were people's living rooms. Most concerts were very small in houses, intimate social gatherings, where today's flutists have to project through an entire concert hall. A final distinction I'd like to point out is the use of vibrato on these two instruments. On the modern flute, we are expected to help the metal resonate through the use of vibrato, whereas on the Baroque flute, the use of vibrato was produced with the fingers rather than the breath. So if I were to play a G on this instrument, if I wanted to add vibrato, what I would do is just kind of wiggle my finger over the next closest tone hole so that it would create a wave in the sound without me having to do it with my breath. It's a much more delicate and subtle type of vibrato than what we are accustomed to on our modern instruments. I first started playing this instrument when I was working on my doctorate at Florida State, and although I didn't have a very good experience with it in the beginning, I took much more interest in the recorder, which finally, a decade later, brought me back to this instrument, which I have really grown to adore. I think as a modern flutist, it is so important that we understand the history of not only the instrument that our modern flute came from, but also to better play and understand the music of the Baroque period. I hope that this video has been informative, and I hope that you are more curious about researching the differences between our modern instrument and our Baroque flute. Thank you so much.